Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The wind had died just after sundown, leaving the desert hills wrapped in a silence that pressed close, heavy and unbroken. Inside a cabin built of rough pine, a single lamp glowed faintly, its light falling across a table scarred by years of use. A tin cup of coffee sat cooling there, half-finished, forgotten. Elias Turner leaned forward, elbows braced on the wood, his calloused hands clasped together as if in thought, though he wasn't thinking of much at all. The cabin was small, one room only, bed against the corner, stove at the wall, a bench beneath the narrow window. Sparse but orderly. A Henry rifle rested within easy reach beside the door. Not because he expected trouble, but because men who lasted out here knew trouble always came when it was least welcome. He was 40 years old, though the years weighed heavier on him than that number suggested. Once, Elias had ridden with the cavalry through the bitter final campaigns of the war. He had seen good men fall in mud and dust, heard their cries echo in fields that never forgave. The war ended, but the noise of it lingered inside him. He had taken his mustering out pay and bought this patch of land, far from neighbors, far from curious eyes. Solitude was a choice. Better the silence of the high desert than the hollow talk of town. Outside, the horizon still carried the faint glow of a dying sun, fading now into blue-black night. Elias's thoughts wandered no further than the work that waited for him tomorrow. The north fence line sagging under its own weight. The well that needed its rope checked before the frost came down from the mountains. Simple problems, steady problems. Problems that did not bleed. Then it came. A sound too soft to belong in the wilderness. 2 quick knocks against the wooden door. Not the confident rap of a neighbor, nor the heavy pound of a man. Elias's head came up, heart giving a hard, single thud in his chest. No one came this far without a reason. He rose slowly, chair scraping the floorboards, every sense awake. For a long moment he stood still, listening. Only the faint hiss of the stove, the groan of the wind slipping through the chinks of the cabin wall. His hand hovered at the latch, mind racing through possibilities. A traveler lost, a drunk wandered too far from town, or worse. Elias glanced once toward the rifle. Then, after a breath that felt heavier than it should, he slid the latch and opened the door. The night air spilled in cold and sharp as Elias pulled the door wide. A figure stood there in the dust, small against the sweep of the desert sky. She was barefoot, her feet pale with cuts and grit, her legs trembling as if they might give way beneath her. The garment she wore was little more than a deerskin dress, the seams frayed, the hem torn and stained from long miles. Her dark hair fell loose to her shoulders, tangled with bits of beadwork and leather, a shadow against her face. She couldn't have been more than 23, maybe younger, yet her eyes were older, dark, watchful, braced for danger. Her breath came in quick bursts, uneven, and though she said nothing, Elias felt the unspoken plea in the way she swayed on her feet. For a moment, he didn't move. A man had no obligation out here, no law but his own. To take her in was to invite whatever trouble followed. To turn her away was to leave her to the cold, where the coyotes and the night would finish what hunger and exhaustion had begun. A verse came unbidden, one his mother had made him memorize as a boy, long before the war. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Hebrews 13:2. The words settled in his chest heavier than the rifle ever could. Elias stepped back and held the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice lower than he meant. She hesitated, eyes flicking past him into the cabin as if she feared a trap. Then, with a small tightening of her jaw, she crossed the threshold. Her steps were soundless, careful. The warmth of the stove met her first. She stopped near the fire, standing stiff as if she dared not touch anything. The shadows of the room softened her sharp outline, yet she looked even smaller inside, shoulders squared, hands loose at her sides as if bracing for the order to leave. Elias closed the door behind her, shutting out the bite of the night. For a long breath he studied her, the dirt streaking her arms, the raw scrapes across her knuckles, the way she stood straight despite it all. "Sit," he said quietly, nodding toward the bench. She didn't. Her eyes stayed on him, wary, silent. Elias moved instead. He lifted the kettle from the stove, poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup, and set it on the table. "It's warm. Take it." She crossed the room slowly, like a deer edging toward water, and wrapped both hands around the cup. Her fingers were scraped and bruised, nails chipped. She sipped, eyes never leaving him, and for the first time since the knock at the door, Elias breathed a little easier. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The fire hissed softly in the stove, throwing a red glow across the cabin walls. Ioka sat on the bench, shoulders wrapped tight in the wool blanket Elias had given her. She held the tin cup with both hands, sipping slowly, like each swallow was weighed against the silence. Her dark eyes flicked toward him often, quick glances that darted away as soon as he noticed. Elias busied himself at the table, cutting a piece of bread, setting it on a plate with a strip of salt pork. He slid it across to her without a word. She hesitated, then took it, eating steady but never hurried, each bite small. Watching her, Elias thought of half-starved horses he had seen after the war, creatures that knew hunger too well to waste a crumb. When the plate was empty, he set another tin cup on the table, filling it from the kettle. Steam curled upward. "Water," he said simply, pushing it toward her. She nodded once and drank. The silence stretched. Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes half on the fire, half on the young woman now folded small on his bench. Her presence filled the cabin in a way he hadn't felt in years. For months, every sound here had been his own: the scrape of his chair, the creak of the wood, his boots on the floorboards. Tonight there was another rhythm, her breath, light and careful, weaving into the air between them. He returned to the stove, pulled down a small pot of beans he had left soaking. Setting it on the heat, he stirred them slow with the end of a wooden spoon. The smell drifted, heavy and warm. He placed 2 tin plates on the table, then paused. Old habits stirred, a ritual he had nearly let die in the silence of his exile. He sat across from her, bowed his head, and spoke the words low. "Give us this day our daily bread." Matthew 6:11. When he lifted his eyes, he found Ioka watching him, her brow faintly furrowed, as if trying to make sense of the words. She didn't ask. She only ate, quiet, her movements steady. But Elias thought he saw something soften in her posture, as though the simple act of prayer had changed the shape of the silence between them. The beans were plain, the pork thin, yet she finished everything he set before her. When the plates were cleared, Elias rose and fetched an extra blanket from the foot of his bed. He laid it folded on the bench beside her. "You'll be warm enough there," he said. She looked at the blanket, then at him, eyes sharp as if measuring his truth. Finally, she pulled it over herself, curling sideways on the bench, her knees drawn close. Elias returned to the table. He did not try to sleep. Instead, he sat with his hands clasped before him, elbows planted on the wood, watching the fire burn down to coals. From the corner of his eye, he saw her shoulders relax, her breath slowing as sleep at last pulled her under. For the first time in months, the cabin no longer felt like an empty shelter in the wilderness. It felt like it mattered who slept inside its walls. Morning came gray and cold, the kind that settled into the bones before a man even stepped outside. Elias had been awake since first light, moving quietly about the cabin, feeding the fire, setting the kettle to boil. He wasn't surprised when he turned and found Ayoka already watching him, her dark hair tangled from sleep, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She had the alertness of someone who never let herself rest too deep. "You sleep?" he asked. She nodded once. "Some." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one in front of her. She took it with both hands, sipping slow, her eyes never leaving his face. Elias turned to the stove, stirring the pot of beans left from the night before. It wasn't much, but it would be warm. After they ate, he shrugged into his coat. "Work to do," he said, half to himself, half to her. He carried the bucket outside to the well, the cold biting at his skin. When he returned, he stopped short at the door. Ayoka was sweeping the cabin floor with a short broom, her movements careful, deliberate. She did not look up when he entered, but the set of her shoulders told him it wasn't a question, it was simply something she had chosen to do. "You don't have to," he said. She paused, straightened, and met his eyes. "I stay. I work." Elias studied her a long moment, then gave a short nod. Out here, no one carried weight for free. If she wanted to claim her place beneath his roof, work was a fair trade. The day stretched in small tasks. He split kindling by the chopping block while she stacked the pieces into neat rows beside the wall. Her grip on the hatchet was clumsy at first, but she watched him close, then tried herself. The blows came uneven, the wood splitting jagged, but she did not give up until she had her own small pile to show. Elias said nothing, only moved aside to let her keep at it. There was a strange comfort in the rhythm, the rise and fall of the axe, the scrape of wood being stacked, 2 sets of hands instead of one. Later, when the work slowed, Elias carried the bucket of water inside while she tended the fire. She crouched before the stove, humming low under her breath. The sound was faint, almost lost beneath the crackle of the wood, but Elias caught it, a melody soft and winding, words in a tongue he did not know. He stood still, listening. It was no hymn he recognized, yet it held the weight of something older, a song shaped by memory. She broke off when she realized he was watching, her eyes wary again. Elias lowered himself into the chair by the table, bowing his head for a moment before lifting it again. No words spoken aloud this time, but his lips had moved in silent prayer. When he looked up, Ayoka was still watching him. For the first time since she had crossed his threshold, she did not look away. The firelight flickered between them, and the silence that followed was not sharp, not suspicious. It was different, almost steady. By the second evening, the sky had turned hard and clear, the air sharp with the promise of frost. Elias set another log into the stove, the fire snapping as sparks leapt. Ayoka sat on the bench again, the blanket drawn close, her knees tucked beneath her. She had said little all day, but he had grown used to her silence. It was not empty, only guarded. He set 2 tin plates on the table and ladled beans into them, the smell filling the cabin with something steady, if not rich. They ate without speaking at first, the scrape of spoons the only sound. When his plate was empty, Elias leaned back, staring at the stove as if the fire inside it could burn through the walls of memory he had kept sealed. "You ever fight in a war?" Ayoka asked suddenly, her English halting but clear. The question landed heavy. Elias's hand stilled on the rim of his plate. He had not spoken of it in years. Yet her eyes were steady on him, and something in the way she asked, without judgment, only searching, loosened the knot in his chest. "I did," he said at last. His voice sounded rough, as if the truth had to scrape its way out. "Cavalry, rode through Shiloh, Vicksburg, all the way to Appomattox. Too many fields stained with blood. Too many boys buried where they fell." She listened without moving, her face unreadable in the firelight. "I was younger than I should have been," Elias went on. "Thought it would be glory. It wasn't. Just mud, smoke, men crying out for their mothers as they bled. I still hear them sometimes, when the night gets too quiet." The fire popped, and for a moment neither spoke.
Elias stared into the flames, seeing not the wood but the faces of men he had lost. When it ended, I came back to nothing worth speaking of. My wife. His voice caught, the words faltering. He drew a slow breath, forcing them out. She didn't last long after. Fever took her. I buried her myself. After that, he gestured vaguely at the cabin, the emptiness of it. I came here. Figured silence was better company than ghosts. Ioka lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening on the blanket. When she spoke, her words were quiet. You still love her. Elias swallowed hard. Yes. The admission felt both like a wound and a balm. They sat in the weight of it for a long while. Elias had expected the confession to sour the air, to make the cabin feel smaller, but instead it eased something inside him. For the first time, he realized that saying the words did not chain him. It set him freer than he had been in years. Ioka finally looked up, her eyes dark but softened. She did not offer comfort in words, only the steady presence of her gaze. And somehow, that was enough. The wind rose after sundown, rattling the shutters and carrying the scent of sage across the barren hills. Elias sat at the table, mending a broken strap with his knife. Ioka crouched near the stove, feeding in thin sticks of kindling, her face lit by the glow of the fire. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of wood. Then she spoke, her voice low, as if the words might break if pushed too hard. My father, she began slowly, died 2 winters ago. Fever, same as your wife. My brothers, both gone before that, huntin' raid. Only me and my mother left. Elias set the strap down, the knife still in his hand, but he did not move. He let the words settle. My mother, she went on, eyes fixed on the fire, not strong enough. She follow soon after. Her voice tightened, but she did not falter. Then camp, different. No family, no place. Man look at me with hunger. One came at night. He think no one stop him. Her fingers clenched on the edge of the blanket, knuckles pale. I take knife, cut him. He lived, but they say I brought shame. They say I must go. If I stay, worse would come. Silence fell heavy in the cabin.
The fire's glow painted her face in shifting light, half in shadow, half bare. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze steady on her. He thought of the women he'd seen in towns cast out for less, left with no one to speak for them. He thought of the men who had claimed to be protectors but turned their hands to cruelty instead. You did what you had to, he said finally, his voice even. She looked at him then, sharp, as if testing whether he truly believed it. His jaw stayed firm, his eyes unflinching. Whatever she saw seemed enough, for her shoulders eased slightly, the tension loosening though it did not vanish. For the first time since she had entered his cabin, Ioka's guard shifted. Not gone, but cracked just enough for Elias to glimpse the weight she carried. He sat back, letting the silence breathe. It was not the kind of story a man answered with easy comfort. Words would not mend what had been taken from her. Only time, and the choice to believe she was safe now, could do that. Outside, the wind drove harder, scraping across the land like a restless spirit. Inside, the two of them sat in quiet, bound not by blood nor tribe, but by the shared knowledge of loss and exile. For Elias, it was the first time he saw her not only as a stranger at his table, but as someone whose pain mirrored his own. The morning broke hard and bright, the sky washed clean after a night of wind. Elias was outside splitting logs when he caught the faint stir of dust along the horizon. He lowered the axe, narrowed his eyes. 2 riders were moving slow across the flats, angling toward the cabin. His jaw tightened. Travelers didn't wander this way by accident. He set the axe aside, picked up the Henry rifle from its resting place against the cabin wall, and stood waiting by the woodpile.
Inside, through the half-open door, he caught a glimpse of Ioka crouched near the stove, unaware of what approached. The riders drew close enough for him to see their faces. Hard men, dust ground deep into their coats, rifles sheathed in their saddles. One tipped his hat, the gesture more mock than courtesy. "Mornin'," the man called. "Mornin'," Elias answered flatly. "We're looking for someone," the first man said. "Young Apache girl, came this way on foot."
"You seen her?" Elias didn't move. His grip on the rifle stayed loose but ready. "Can't say I have." The second man leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes sliding toward the cabin. "Mind if we take a look around?" "I do mind." Elias's voice was calm but iron-edged. The first rider smiled thin, like a man testing wire for weakness. "Ain't looking for trouble, mister. Just trying to fetch what belongs back at camp." Elias stepped forward until he stood square between them and his door. "She's not here. You've asked, now you can ride." The air stretched tight. For a moment, Elias thought they might push it. The weight of their stares, the creak of leather as one shifted in the saddle. His finger rested steady along the rifle stock, not on the trigger, but close enough. Finally, the first man spat into the dirt. "Fine, but if you see her, you tell her folks are looking." They turned their horses, riding slow, throwing glances back over their shoulders. Dust rose behind them, fading into the wide horizon. Elias waited until they were a speck against the land before lowering the rifle. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. Inside, he found Ioka standing near the fire, her hands clenched white against the blanket. Her eyes searched his face before she spoke, voice low but certain. "They come back." "Maybe," Elias admitted, setting the rifle back against the wall, "but they won't take you from here." She stared at him as if weighing whether his words were stone or smoke. When she saw no wavering in his expression, her shoulders eased, just slightly. For the first time, she stepped closer, closing the space between them. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why?" Elias's answer came steady. "Because you're under my roof, and I don't give up what's mine to men like that." The riders' dust trail had long since vanished into the horizon, but the weight of their presence lingered in the cabin. The silence inside was no longer the wary hush of strangers, but the taut stillness of two people who understood the danger pressing close. Ioka sat at the table, her blanket draped around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had not touched the bread Elias set before her. Her fingers worried at the edge of the wool, twisting and untwisting as though the fabric might unravel her fear. Elias busied himself at the stove, though his thoughts churned just as hard. He stirred beans that did not need stirring, added wood to a fire already steady, anything to keep his hands moving. He had faced gunfire, seen men fall under cannon and shot, but the thought of these two riders returning with more men tightened his chest in a way the battlefield never had. Finally, he set the spoon aside and crossed to the table. He sat across from her, leaning forward, his voice low but certain. "They won't touch you here." Her eyes lifted, dark and sharp, searching his face. "You mean it?" "I do." For a long moment she held his gaze. Then she let out a slow breath, her shoulders sagging as if a burden had eased, if only a little. She reached for the bread and tore off a piece, chewing in silence. The meal passed without words, but not without meaning. When the plates were cleared, Elias bowed his head again, this time in prayer spoken just above a whisper. The words were plain, but steady. Gratitude for food, for the fire, for the strength to endure another day. Ioka watched him, her expression unreadable. Then, softly, she began to hum, the same lullaby he had heard the day before. Her voice was fragile but sure, the notes winding into the air like smoke. For the first time, she did not stop when she caught him listening.
Something shifted between them then, subtle but certain. What had begun as mere survival, the sharing of food, the trading of warmth, was becoming something else. Not trust built overnight, but the beginning of belonging. That night she lay again on the bench, wrapped tight in her blanket. Elias sat at the table longer than he meant to, watching the fire burn low. Every so often his eyes drifted toward her, listening to the slow rhythm of her breath. It was a sound that no longer felt foreign, but necessary, proof that he was not alone within these walls. When a sudden gust rattled the shutters, she stirred, clutching the blanket closer. Elias rose, crossed the room, and adjusted the wool around her shoulders. She blinked awake, her gaze meeting his in the dim glow of the fire. "You safe?" he said quietly. She did not answer with words. Instead, she let her eyes soften, her breath ease, and for the first time she closed her eyes again without fear.
Elias returned to his chair, the rifle resting close at hand. He knew the riders might return, maybe tomorrow, maybe weeks from now. But for tonight, the danger had passed. For tonight, the cabin was no longer just his. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The wind had not rested since sundown. It pressed against the shutters, moaning low, carrying with it the chill of the high desert night. Elias sat at the table with the rifle across his lap, not because he expected the riders back tonight, but because the thought of them had not left his mind. Across the room, Ayoka sat curled on the bench, the wool blanket drawn tight around her shoulders. The fire painted her face in shifting lines of light and shadow. For a long while, neither of them spoke. At last, Elias broke the silence. "You haven't told me all of it," he said. His voice was calm but steady, carrying more weight than question. Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp, then away again. "You know enough." "I know a piece," he answered, "not the whole." The blanket shifted as she drew her knees tighter beneath her. For a moment he thought she would stay silent, retreat into the walls she had built. But then her voice came low, halting, as though each word carried its own wound. "In my camp I had no family left. Father gone, mother buried, brothers dead." She swallowed, her gaze fixed on the fire. "When a man came at night, I fought. I cut him with a knife. He lived, but the elders said I brought shame, said I must go, alone." Her hand tightened on the blanket, knuckles white. "They cast me out like a dog." The words filled the cabin heavier than the storm outside. Elias leaned forward, setting the rifle gently against the table. "So you ran," he said. She nodded once, her eyes still locked on the flames. 3 nights, no fire, no food, if not for your door." Her voice trailed into silence. For a long moment, Elias said nothing. He saw her shoulders rigid beneath the blanket, as if bracing for his judgment. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the stovepipe. Finally, he spoke. "You fought because he gave you no choice. That's no shame." Her head turned then, eyes flashing in the dim light. "The others thought different." "The others weren't here," Elias said simply. His tone carried no doubt, no hesitation. "I am." The words seemed to hang between them, heavier than any oath. For the first time since she had stepped into his cabin, Ayoka's gaze held his and did not look away. The wind rattled the shutters again, but inside the room a different silence settled, not sharp, not suspicious, but charged with something new. She had laid her truth bare, and Elias had not turned from it. In that moment, both of them knew there was no turning back. The fire had burned low, glowing red in the stove. Outside, the wind roared along the ridges, but inside the cabin, the air was taut with the weight of what had been spoken. Ayoka had given her truth, and now the silence pressed back, waiting. Elias sat with his elbows braced on the table, his rough hands clasped tight. He could feel her eyes on him, steady, searching, as if she knew there was something yet unsaid. And she was right. He drew a breath that scraped in his chest. "You told me your past," he said quietly. "I owe you mine." Ayoka tilted her head, her dark hair falling across her shoulder. She said nothing, only waited. "I wasn't always alone out here," Elias began.
His gaze dropped to his hands, the scars that lined them. "After the war, I came back broken. Thought if I worked hard enough, I could forget the things I'd seen. And for a while, I did. My wife, she helped me find something like peace again." The words came rough, each one pulled from a place he had buried deep. But sickness came through, fever. His voice faltered, his throat tightening. I sat by her bed, held her hand, listened to her breathing grow shallow until there was nothing left to hold on to. I buried her myself on the ridge behind the house. After that, he gestured faintly at the cabin, the empty room around them. I stayed here because there was nothing worth going back to. The admission hung heavy. He had not spoken it aloud in years, had not dared. The silence after felt raw, dangerous. When he finally lifted his eyes, Ayoka was watching him, her expression softer than he had ever seen. She shifted, the blanket sliding from one shoulder, and for the first time she crossed the space between them, not out of fear, but of choice. She lowered herself to sit at the other side of the table, close enough that the firelight touched both their faces. "You still love her," she said quietly. Elias nodded once. The ache in his chest was sharp, but honest. "Yes, I always will." Her gaze did not waver. "That make you good, not weak." He blinked, taken aback by the steadiness in her words. For so long he had carried his grief as a mark of failure, a reason to hide from the world. But in her eyes, it was not shame, it was proof of his heart. For a long moment they sat in silence, their truths laid bare between them. Outside, the storm clawed at the hills. Inside, something softer, stronger, began to take root. The days that followed carried a strange new rhythm. Work filled the hours, as it always had, mending fences, hauling water, feeding the livestock. But now there were two sets of hands, two sets of footsteps crossing the yard. The chores were done faster, but that wasn't what Elias noticed most. What struck him was the sound of another voice, the sight of someone else moving through the cabin. The silence that had once wrapped the place like a shroud no longer felt so heavy. At night, when the work was behind them and the fire burned steady in the stove, they found themselves sitting across from each other in the quiet. Sometimes Ayoka hummed, the same low, lilting lullaby that seemed to carry with it the memory of her people. Other times, Elias bowed his head, offering a prayer before the meal. One evening, as the flames cast their glow across the room, Elias whispered the words from Scripture. "The Lord is near to the broken-hearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. When he lifted his head, Ayoka's eyes were on him, dark and searching. "That your God's promise?" she asked softly. "It is," Elias said. His voice carried the weight of someone who had clung to those words in the darkest hours. "It kept me standing when nothing else would." She was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "Your words, they like song of my people, for the broken ones." After that, their silence felt less like distance and more like a thread binding them together. He would watch her fingers move as she mended a torn hem, or listen to the way her voice wove through the lullaby. She would glance up from the fire and see him whittling, the shavings piling on the floor, his eyes steady and calm.
They spoke little, yet everything seemed to be said. One night, the wind beat hard against the cabin walls, the shutters rattling as though the riders themselves clawed at the door. Ioka stirred, pulling the blanket closer. Without thinking, Elias reached across the table and set his hand near hers. Not touching, just close enough that the warmth bridged the space. She looked at him, uncertain for a heartbeat, then let her hand rest where it was. The fire crackled, the storm raged, but inside there was a quiet unlike anything Elias had felt in years. Not the silence of loneliness, but of companionship. He realized then that what bound them was no longer just danger or circumstance. It was the beginning of something chosen, fragile, but real. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped through the cabin walls and lingered in the bones. Elias kept the fire fed, each log sending up a burst of sparks as the flames leapt higher. Across the room, Ioka sat cross-legged on the floor, sewing a small tear in her dress with careful, practiced movements. Elias watched her from his chair, the rhythm of her hands steady, patient. He told himself he was only noticing the work, but the truth ran deeper. There was a quiet strength in her, something unyielding, even after all she had endured. When she finished, she smoothed the fabric across her lap and looked up. Their eyes met in the shifting glow of the fire. Neither spoke. Slowly, Ioka rose, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She crossed the short space between them, her steps soundless on the wooden floor. She stopped at his side, close enough that he could see the firelight caught in her dark hair, close enough to hear the quiet rush of her breath. "You help me," she said softly. "But why?" Elias swallowed, searching for the words that had been waiting inside him for days. "Because no one helped me when I needed it most. Because I know what it is to lose everything. And because," he faltered, the truth catching in his throat, "because you matter, Ioka, more than you know." Her gaze held his, unblinking, steady. "You mean that?" "I do." The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, filled with the weight of all they had spoken and all they had not. Elias felt the moment stretch, delicate as glass. Then, almost without thought, he lifted his hand. Slowly, he brushed a strand of hair back from her face. She did not flinch. Instead, she leaned ever so slightly into his touch, her eyes softening. His breath came slow. He let the moment rest, giving her every chance to step away. But she did not. So he bent forward, closing the distance, and pressed his lips gently to hers. It was not hurried, not fierce, but steady, like the meeting of two weary souls who had carried too much alone. Her lips were warm, her hand rising to rest lightly against his jaw. For a heartbeat, the cabin, the storm, the riders, all of it fell away. There was only the fire and them. When they parted, she stayed close, her forehead resting against his. "You safe now," she whispered. Elias closed his eyes, his hand still cradling her cheek. "And so are you." The next morning dawned pale and sharp, frost silvering the edges of the grass outside. Elias had been up since before first light, tending the fire, putting on coffee. He moved quieter than usual, careful not to wake her. But when he turned, he saw Ioka already stirring on the bench, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her dark eyes watching him. "You wake early," he said, offering a faint smile. She tilted her head, her lips curving in the ghost of an answer. "Fire low, I keep warm." Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. She accepted it with both hands, sipping slow, the steam rising against her face. For a while, they sat in silence, the cabin filled only with the small sounds of morning, the crackle of wood, the clink of tin. Finally, Elias set his cup down. His rough hands rested on the table, but his voice carried a steadiness she had not heard before.
"Ioka, you don't have to leave. Not tomorrow, not ever. This place can be yours if you want it." Her gaze snapped to his, searching, as though weighing each word. "You mean I stay?" "I mean you belong here," he said, "not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as part of this home, for as long as you choose." For a heartbeat, the words hung heavy in the air. Elias felt the weight of them himself. He had spoken promises to no one since his wife, and the act of saying them now cut through years of silence. Ayoka's brow furrowed, suspicion flickering across her face. "Why? I bring trouble. Men come. You fight for me. You risk." Elias leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. "Because you're worth the risk. Because no one should walk this world alone. And because—" he let out a slow breath, the truth unshaken. "I don't want this cabin without you in it." Her lips parted, but no words came at first. Instead, she stared at him, as though trying to see if he would falter. When he didn't, something shifted in her expression. The hardness gave way to something softer, something she had not allowed him to see before. Slowly, she nodded. "Then I stay. With you." The simple words struck deeper than any oath Elias had spoken. He felt a release inside, like the loosening of a knot that had been tied for years. The fire popped, sending sparks against the grate. Outside, the land stretched wide and empty, but inside the cabin, a new fullness had taken root. The day passed quietly, but neither forgot the riders. Elias checked the horizon more often than usual, scanning for dust trails against the pale winter sky. Ioka, too, moved with an alertness in her step, her eyes drifting often toward the hills. Yet the men never came, and as the sun slipped low, the cabin once again became an island of light against the gathering dark. Inside, the fire glowed warm. Ioka sat on the bench, her knees drawn close, while Elias cleaned his rifle with practiced hands. The silence between them no longer felt guarded, it was steady, companionable. Still, the memory of danger lingered, wrapping the room in quiet tension. At last Ioka spoke, her voice low. "You think they return?" Elias set the rifle aside, his jaw firm. "Maybe, but if they do, they'll find me ready." Her eyes lingered on him, studying his face, his steadiness. "Why you fight for me? You could let them take me. Safer for you." He shook his head. "Safer, maybe, but wrong. You're under my roof, and I don't give up what's mine to men like that." The words seemed to still her. For a long moment she did not move, did not blink. Then, slowly, she stood and crossed the room, stopping just before him. Her hand rose, light as a whisper, to rest against his chest. "You mean that?" she said softly. "I do." The fire cracked, filling the silence that followed. Ioka's hand lingered, then lowered. She turned toward the bed, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "Bench hard," she murmured. "Bed big." Elias froze, the meaning of her words settling between them. He had not shared that bed with anyone since the day he buried his wife. For a moment, his breath caught, torn between memory and the fragile hope standing before him. "You sure?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She looked at him, steady, unafraid. "I trust you." The words cut deeper than any vow. Slowly, Elias stood and crossed the room. He lay down on the edge of the bed, leaving space between them. She turned on her side to face him, her dark eyes glimmering in the firelight. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Elias lifted his hand, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She did not pull away. "Good night," he whispered. "Good night," she answered. She shifted closer, her forehead resting lightly against his shoulder, her breathing warm against his chest. He wrapped an arm around her, not in possession, but in protection. For the first time in years, his body eased into rest. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters. But inside, the cabin was warm.
For the first time since the war, Elias slept with peace. And when dawn came, Ioka was still there, still close, still choosing to stay. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. The first light of dawn crept through the shutters, soft and gray against the cabin walls. Elias stirred, blinking against the pale glow, disoriented for a moment until the warmth beside him brought it all rushing back. Ioka lay still, curled lightly against his chest, her breathing slow and even. Her dark hair spilled across the blanket, catching the faint light like strands of shadow and silver. Elias did not move, afraid that shifting even an inch might break the fragile peace that had settled between them. For years he had woken to nothing but silence, the hollow groan of the wind, the creak of the wood. Now the sound of her breathing filled the room, steady and alive. It struck him with quiet force. The cabin was no longer empty. When she stirred at last, her eyes opening to meet his, there was no fear in them, only calm. "You slept?" he asked softly. She nodded, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "Better than ground." Elias returned the smile, rare but unguarded. "Better than ground," he agreed. They rose together, moving through the rhythm of morning as if it had always been so. Elias stoked the fire and set the coffee pot on the stove. Ioka fetched water from the barrel, her blanket still draped over her shoulders. When she set the basin down, he caught the small pride in her eyes, as if she, too, felt the cabin had changed. They shared breakfast at the table, beans, bread, and steaming coffee. Elias bowed his head, his voice low but steady as he prayed. "Give us this day our daily bread." Matthew 6:11. When he lifted his gaze, Ioka was watching him, her expression unreadable but softer than before. She said nothing, only tore the bread in half and handed him a piece first. After the meal, Elias shrugged into his coat. "We'll check the fence line," he said. "Cattle'll test it after last night's wind." Ioka nodded, rising without hesitation. Together they saddled the mare, Elias lifting her up before swinging into the saddle behind. The contact no longer felt uncertain. It felt steady, right. They rode along the northern fence, the air sharp with frost. The land stretched wide and silent, the kind of silence that once weighed heavy on Elias. Now it was different. Each time he pointed to a sagging post, Ioka dismounted first, steadying the wire with practiced hands while he drove it deeper. She worked without complaint, her movements sure, as though each task anchored her further into this life. At the far end of the line, Elias paused, resting his hand on the post. "Riders might come back," he said quietly. "But if they do, I'll be ready." Ioka looked out across the hills, her jaw tight. Then she turned to him, her eyes steady. "Not just you, me too." The words struck him with quiet weight. She was not simply surviving under his roof. She was choosing to stand with him. They returned to the cabin by midday, their boots dusted white with frost, their hands raw from work. Yet when Elias looked across the yard and saw her carrying the bucket with quiet determination, he felt something settle in his chest, something he had not felt in years. That evening, as the sun sank low, Elias sat at the table with his worn Bible open before him. The words were faint on the page, softened by time and handling. He read aloud, his voice steady though quiet, letting the scripture fill the room. Ioka sat near the fire, listening, her face bathed in the warm glow. She did not understand every word, but when she began to hum softly, her lullaby weaving with his prayer, Elias felt the two worlds meet, the songs of her people, the faith of his own, braided together in hope. The storm of yesterday had not vanished. The riders might yet return. But for the first time since the war, Elias felt something stronger than fear, something deeper than grief. He felt the beginning of a home. The days that followed carried a new steadiness.
Morning came with the pale light spilling over the ridges, the fire warm in the stove, and the sound of 2 sets of footsteps moving across the cabin floor. Chores no longer weighed heavy. Split between them, the work turned into rhythm, a quiet partnership. Ioka had spent years carrying silence like a burden. Now that silence was filled, with her humming as she swept, the scrape of her knife cutting kindling, the murmur of her voice when she asked him simple questions in halting English. Each sound told him he was no longer alone. One cold afternoon, as they hauled water from the well, Elias paused. His gaze shifted toward the hills, narrowing.
Faint lines pressed into the earth, horse tracks. They were not fresh, but they were there, a reminder that the riders had not vanished. He felt Ioka come up beside him, the bucket swinging from her hand. She followed his gaze, her jaw tightening. They pass again? Maybe, Elias said. He set the bucket down, his hand brushing the worn wood of the rifle slung over his shoulder. But if they do, they won't find you alone. Her eyes lingered on him, searching, weighing. Not just me, you too, she said quietly. We stand. Elias felt the truth of it settle deep. She was no longer a frightened exile clinging to his hearth. She was his partner, his equal, ready to face whatever storm might come. That evening, after supper, Elias pulled something from the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. A quilt, faded but carefully kept, patched in places where time had worn it thin. It had belonged to his wife, his last tether to a life long buried. For years he had not touched it, afraid of what it meant. Now he draped it across the bed where Ioka sat, her fingers brushing the fabric with reverence. This was hers, he said quietly. I kept it because I couldn't let go. But I think, maybe, it's time it keeps us both. Ioka looked up at him, her eyes softening. She did not speak, only nodded once. Her hand rested lightly atop the quilt, then on his. Later, as the fire burned low, Elias opened his Bible, the same page worn by years of use. His voice was steady as he read aloud. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. When he closed the book, Ioka began to hum her lullaby again. This time, the melody wove around his words, lifting them, carrying them. 2 songs, 2 worlds, meeting in the quiet glow of the cabin. That night, beneath the quilt that carried both memory and promise, they lay together not in fear, nor in loneliness, but in belonging. Elias felt the weight of her head on his shoulder, the warmth of her presence, and for the first time in years, he let himself imagine tomorrow, not as an emptiness to endure, but as a life to share. When dawn broke, the wind carried sharp across the plains, rattling the shutters. Elias rose, shrugging into his coat, and stepped outside. The land stretched wide and harsh as it always had, but he no longer saw emptiness. He saw the smoke curling from his chimney, the sound of her moving inside, the promise of laughter waiting in the yard. The west had not softened. It remained a place of dust, danger, and silence. But within that silence, Elias Keene and Ioka had found something rare, hope. And when he turned back toward the cabin, toward the light spilling from its doorway, he knew with a certainty that no riders, no storm, no loneliness could take it away. For the cabin was no longer a refuge, it was a home. Out on the frontier, life was never easy. The West was a place of dust, hunger, loneliness, and danger, but also of resilience, kindness, and unexpected grace. Perhaps, in the quiet bond between Elias and Ioka, you heard an echo of your own memories. A time when loss weighed heavy, when a helping hand made all the difference, or when trust slowly grew where fear once lived. Their story reminds us that no one was meant to walk this world alone. In the brokenness of the past, God often weaves new beginnings, just as he did in that small cabin under the wide New Mexico sky. If this tale touched your heart, don't let it end here. Like the pioneers before us, share it, pass it on, and keep these true Wild West stories alive. Subscribe, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and join us as we bring more of these timeless journeys back to life.